Greetings, everybody. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I'm seeing that the participants in today's special webinar are joining us, and so I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction while the rest of you join. So again, welcome to our special webinar on how to work on a 2020 campaign. I am so happy we're able to do this today and really so grateful. I want to especially thank Senator Heidi Heitkamp, Watson Senior Fellow, because it was really her idea to do this event. And I think the idea resonated with so many of us at Watson because in terms of values, we always want to encourage students and really everybody to participate in politics, whether by voting or whether by working directly on a campaign, and no matter where that is on the political spectrum. But you know, most of us at Watson, we don't really know the nuts and bolts of how to get involved in a campaign. And we're so lucky today to have panelists who have tremendous knowledge. And at the same time, we're all facing really uncertain circumstances, including circumstances about how campaigns are going to unfold over the coming months. And so it's particularly fortunate that we have such a great panel to discuss those issues. I'm going to introduce the panel in just a moment, but let me say a word to all of our participants about how the webinar will function. The panel and I will speak for about 20 minutes just to begin the session, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you, the participants. So right now, you should start thinking about questions. And there are two ways that you can ask questions. One way is to just click on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then you can just write in questions, and I'll be monitoring that Q&A channel. And then the other way is I'm also monitoring the attendees. And if you want to raise your hand digitally, I will call on you and unmute you, and then you can just ask questions with your audio. So think of questions right now. Let me very quickly introduce the panel. I am going to do a terrible injustice by doing very brief introductions for people who have, you know, unbelievable bios and CVs. So let me just quickly run through the panel. Several of these individuals are very familiar to you, the student body. So first, Senator Heidi Heitkamp, who's currently a Watson Senior Fellow. She represented the citizens of North Dakota in the United States Senate from 2013 to 2019. And she's also the founder of the One Country Project, which, as many of you know, is an organization focused on addressing the needs and concerns of rural Americans. Tom Perez, who is also a Watson Senior Fellow and Brown grad, is the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Tom had previously served as Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration. Michael Steele, also a Watson Senior Fellow. We're so lucky here at Brown to have these faculty members. Michael is the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. He served in that capacity from 2009 to 2011. And Michael had also served previously as Lieutenant Governor of Maryland from 2003 to 2007. Jeff Sadowski is a veteran of 5 Republican presidential campaigns and also a number of gubernatorial and Senate runs, all in senior communications roles. He got his start working for President George W. Bush's reelection campaign and subsequently worked for Senators Rob Portman, Kay Bailey Hutchison, John McCain, and Mike DeWine. Libby Schneider is the rural political director at the DNC, and in that role, she's spearheading outreach and mobilization efforts in rural communities across America. Previously, Libby had served as a campaign official in congressional and gubernatorial races and had managed Senator Heitkamp's reelection race in 2008. And Tessa Gould served as Senator Heitkamp's chief of staff for 6 years and was campaign manager for Senator Heitkamp's 2012 senatorial race. Tessa has managed 8 congressional campaigns, 7 victoriously, if I have the record right, very impressive, and has worked on a variety of presidential and statewide races. What a panel. So let me just ask you all generally to comment on what do you think is the key nuts and bolts point that students should know who really want to jump on and get involved in campaigns? Heidi, do you want to lead us off?
I would start with one piece of advice, which is be selfish. And it's probably not going to be something that a chief of staff or a campaign manager would want to hear, but you need to know why you're doing it. And not just to promote and help a candidate, but what skills do you want to develop for the future? What do you want to learn in this process? And once you kind of identify what that is that you want to get out of it, I think you'll have a better idea of what role you could play, whether it's in communications, whether it's in research, whether it is in, you know, outreach and getting out the vote, whether it is in, you know, making sure that you're doing some policy work, whatever role you're thinking about. The other bit of advice that I would give you is the higher up the food chain in campaigns, i.e. if you work on a presidential, you may not get as much out of it as if you worked on a gubernatorial campaign or if you worked on a congressional campaign. And so your role will be enhanced based on the size of the staff. So just keep those two things in mind. Know why you want to do it, because it's intense. This is an experience like none other, but you will make friends and connections like you wouldn't make otherwise. But the other thing I would say is, you know, you may have grandiose plans to run policy for, you know, President Trump or run policy for Biden. It ain't going to happen. You may be running coffee for those guys, but if you're in a congressional race, you will have an opportunity to participate in a much bigger way.
Yeah, I would bring it even further down the food chain to the senator's point. I'm much more of a grassroots guy, and so my orientation is always from the bottom up. And I learned that from my experience as, you know, a young kid growing up in Washington, D.C., which is not the land for Republicans, by the way, in case anyone was wondering. So there are two aspects of this to keep in mind. Today, our politics is more drawn to the idea that you only get to play with your team, you only get to learn from your team. That was not my experience. In fact, my political mentors were some of the more prominent Democrats in the country who were leading the city of Washington, one being the former Mayor Marion Barry. And others would be like my friend Tom Perez, who, even as Lieutenant Governor, his work in county government and working with the state, you know, we formed a friendship and a partnership. So don't be afraid to learn from the opposition, if you will. Don't be afraid to go into a campaign that's not necessarily your tribe. My first campaigns that I worked on were Democratic campaigns. Why? Because I was a Republican in Washington, D.C. So you're outnumbered 10-1. If you want to play politically, you're either going to basically do nothing and not be engaged or learn because the team you're on, doesn't have that kind of bandwidth for whatever political or other reasons. But if you do, then it's not about, you know, oh, I got to change my philosophy or my view of things. It's about, I want to learn how to do this. To Heidi's point, to figure out where I fit in this space and how well I can succeed in this space, you have to be willing to sometimes go beyond the space you're in. And the second part of it for me was very much learning from the bottom up. The road closest to the voters is where you want to be. To Heidi's point, a lot of folks want to come in and be the one sitting in the room inside the inner sanctum inside the, you know, sometimes the best space to be in is the one where you're closest to people, because you learn a lot and you collect a lot of valuable information for everybody upstream to sort of partake in and learn from as well, which increases your value to them because you're in a space they're not, and you're bringing insights and information that go beyond just the normal course of a campaign. So think about it in a number of ways. Certainly target the race or the campaign you like to be involved in. Don't be afraid to cross and play with the other team. It doesn't mean that your philosophy is going to change, or you're not a Republican any longer, or you're not a Democrat any longer. It just means that you're smart and you want to learn as much as you can. And then 3, recognize the opportunity to tap into those grassroots and bring that experience into the campaign, which at the end of the day is a very valuable asset for them.
Great, thank you. Tom?
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I learned a number of things from various experiences, and number one is if you have passion for the person you work for, that makes a real difference, because these jobs are going to be 100-hour-a-week jobs, and when you believe in your principle, it doesn't feel like a job. And so I would urge you to take a look at who you're working for and understand that. Number two, understanding, and I've played a lot of team sports and I've coached a lot of team sports, and understanding that there's no I in team is really, really important. A corollary of that is that other duties as assigned might be the most important part of your job description. You may be hired to do job duty X, but especially if you're working in a gubernatorial campaign or a campaign for Congress, you may end up doing 40 different things. I just helped actually a graduate of the MPP program from Brown, who was in the first class, Ed. I helped him get a job on a Senate campaign about 4 months ago. And what attracted, he's now working on a campaign in Massachusetts. And what attracted him to the folks that hired him was, what do you bring to the table? He was asked. And he said, I'm a Swiss Army knife, and I can do a lot of different things. And if you want someone who can do policy, I can do policy. If you've got to make 1,000 copies of a flyer, I can do that. Anything up and down the food chain, there's nothing that's below me. If you walk into a situation, but you don't do windows, you don't do this, you don't do that, you're not going to last long, and you're not going to add the value that you need to add for these campaigns. I know so many people whose spouses they met in campaigns, and it's because you are a family. I know a few people whose ex-spouses they met in campaigns as well. But I bring that up because it really is an unbelievable experience. And what I would say to all of you is you are the precise age to do this, because you can put all your stuff and load it into the back of a VW Beetle and head out to North Dakota because there's this incredible woman named Heidi Heitkamp, or head to Maryland to help Michael Steele do whatever. And I really urge you to do it now in this time in your life, because as you get older and you start having responsibilities and maybe kids, things of that nature, the demands of this become really, really taxing. And so now is the time to do it. And I tell you, the non-monetary rewards are priceless, because you really do learn a lot of skills that you didn't think you had. One of which is working under immense pressure. DEFCON 1 is the order of the day almost every day. And you develop some really good core competencies when you do that.
Super, thanks, Tom. I mean, it's killing me not to be able to ask follow-up questions to this amazing panel, but I say that to the student participants, please start writing in questions through the Q&A. And also, you're welcome to raise your hands digitally, and I'll monitor that. And in the meantime, we'll continue with the panel. So let me turn to you, Tessa Gould.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me to participate. I'm going to take a slightly different tack to this question, because I think the advice you've heard so far is really good. But, campaigns are really also about your willingness to do whatever needs to get done to get the job done, which the chairman said more eloquently than I am saying right now. Just a very quick story. In 2002, I was Dick Gebhardt's body person for a large part of the Iowa caucuses. I got to know him pretty well, probably saw him more than his wife did And I noticed that whenever we would go into a campaign office, the first thing he would do is walk around and empty the garbages. And so I thought, well, this is weird and like a really bad use of his time if he's running for president to be taking out the garbage, which, by the way, if you've ever been in a campaign office, the garbage is unbelievable.
A lot of fast food.
Yeah. And so I said, Congressman, I'm going to do this the next stop we make so you can talk to people. And he said, oh, no. I like to do it because I want to talk to people who work for me and I want to understand what they're hearing from people who want to vote for me. And that stuck with me for ever. And I think it's a really good lesson about how important it is to not be someone who gets so myopically focused on one thing. And you are aware of what people around you are saying and doing. And those kinds of relationships are incredibly valuable to a candidate and to a campaign manager to get that kind of feedback from you. So I think, being a Swiss Army knife is probably the best advice you can get on how to operate as a staffer.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Jeff Sadowski.
Yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I tend to agree. I think, beyond, this brave new world we're living in right now and changes to Wisconsin elections, what election day is going to be. It is T-minus something there, and there are a finite number of days, a finite number of hours, and a finite number of minutes between now and election day. And yet there's an infinite number of tasks. So the best way to grow, I found, was being someone who didn't just point out something that needed to be done, but step forward immediately and did it. It's the ultimate meritocracy, and that's probably a little bit of a played out cliche, but it's true. If you are able to kind of jump in, fill a void, and yes, kind of be the Swiss Army knife, that has been referenced. Be humble, be willing to take on anything, but building back on Senator Heitkamp's point, be selfish and know, yes, you are doing it for you're doing it because you're helping this cause, but you're also doing it because that gets you involved in more and more of the day-to-day of a campaign. You might have come in as, my background, I started as the intern coming in at 5 a.m. every morning for President Bush's reelect. Did I want to do that? No, but then when there was an opening, they naturally looked around and said, oh, who can fill this? Oh, Jeff stepped up on X. Let's bring him in. Again, be ready, be willing to fill that void every single day and have done the work, be prepared, so that you're not just sitting around waiting for an opportunity, but you are either creating one or you are as prepared as possible for when those opportunities arise. You're that much more likely to rise to the top, because there are, whether it is a presidential campaign or a city council race, anywhere in between, congressional, state rep, Senate, gubernatorial, whatever it might be, there are thousands upon thousands of resumes and really, really well qualified, well connected people who are looking for these same opportunities. All the connections in the world, do they help you get a foot in the door? Yes, but does your ability to, again, fill that void differentiate you in the long run? Way more than any connection might. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jeff. Libby Schneider.
Yeah, tough to go last with this panel of folks, but I have the unique privilege of being on this call with my current boss and two of my former bosses. So my first piece of advice is to don't burn bridges. It's a small political world, and you never know when you'll be sitting on a Zoom panel with your favorite redheaded senator again. But to echo everybody's point, everyone is exactly right. Hard work is what gets you opportunities in campaigns. You can have the best family name and come from wherever you want, but if you don't work hard, you're going to get sniffed out real fast on a campaign. I think one of the things that we all have in common on this call is that we all probably started as interns or the lowest on the food chain, and now, with the exception of me, probably everybody's in very high ranks and work their way up. And so, to Jeff's point, it is, hard work is rewarded, and sticking it out is rewarded. And to Tom's point, you it's not a requirement to believe in the person that you work for, but it certainly helps and makes the job easier. These are incredibly hard jobs with long hours and not always glamorous, certainly not a West Wing style campaign, but they're also the best jobs that I've ever had certainly in my life, and have brought me my best friends and my husband. We talked about campaign husbands. I got mine there. So beyond what it's done for me professionally, personally, these are the places where you can meet your best friends for life and your colleagues for life too.
Fantastic. Let's go to some questions from the students. Satya asked a question that some other folks are asking too, anonymously, really a really basic one. How do you reach out to a campaign? What's the best way to get your foot in the door? Do you do it through the website? Do you do it through email? What's the best way to get involved?
This is Jeff. I'll jump in for a second if it's all right.
Please.
Graduating from college, more years, almost 20 years ago now. I had a bunch of friends in the business school, and there were recruiters coming to campus every day to give interviews, and I'm sitting there saying, "Wait a minute, why? I want a job on the Hill, or I want a job on a campaign. Why aren't they coming to hire?" It's not as cut and dry and easy as it is in so many other in other kind of areas of focus or industries. You've got to be able to be proactive and pound the pavement. You're like 99% of all campaign jobs are never really going to show up on a website. There's not going to be a Facebook ad pointing you. They might be looking for volunteers, and you'll be able to get in that way by volunteering. But more often than not, you're going to have to pick up the phone, call. You're going to have to look and think, all right, who do I know? You're going to while network won't get you everywhere, and relationships connections won't get you everywhere. But scour your networks. Brown's got a huge list of really, really smart and well accomplished alumni across the country involved in politics. Look through that network. Look through any other network you might be able to, and then be willing to get on the phone and just say, "Hey, I'm looking to help. What do what's out there? How can I help?" And be willing to kind of step forward with whatever the position might be. Again, building on Libby's point, most of us started as an intern at one point, whether paid or unpaid, and put in the hours, and then we're able to grow from there.
That's great. Does anybody else want to add to that?
One thing I would say is, again, I mentioned that I coached a lot of team sports, and baseball and basketball were the ones I coached. In baseball, if you bat 1 for 30, you're probably going to end up watching a lot of games after a while. In the world of looking for a political job, 1 for 30 gets you in the Hall of Fame, because you get that foot in the door and you run with it, and the sky's the limit. So don't be afraid. You have to develop a thick skin insofar as you may hear a lot of no's, but again, 1 out of 30 is your ticket to becoming, sky's the limit set of opportunities. So just, I would set a goal every week. I want to make this many contacts with people, and I will do my best to do that. And the more you do that, it's the law of averages are going to catch up with you and work to your favor.
Go ahead.
Can I just, and this goes to Michael and Tom, because they've run the largest political organizations in the United States of America, the RNC and the DNC. If I'm a student out there, I'm going, yeah, but why isn't there like a place where I can go to know who the candidates are and what they need? Is there something like that, Tom or Michael, that students can access so that they can make those resume outreaches?
I can speak to at least a little bit of the RNC, what we did at the time I was there. Can't really speak about what they're doing today because it's very different in some respects. But what we did was we made maximum use of our internship program. So one door to look at and to possibly go through is to contact the DNC. I know the DNC has a very active and strong internship program as well. And Tom can speak to those specifics, but I just had folks, we started to open up the door and say, y'all come in from universities around the country to use that as a launch pad to other opportunities, because once you were inside the building, you then had a closer feel and idea of what the network was. Okay, not everyone gets inside the building. Got that. So the other more important piece is recognize the asset of your state and local parties. A lot of times people really throw them off and go, oh, you know, they're this, they're not that, they're not doing this. And that's just politicians and political types who are ticked off about something because they didn't get their way. The reality of it is your first line of opportunity still remains your local Republican or Democratic Party, your state party apparatus. In Prince George's County, and I'll just give you a quick story. When I moved out of DC into Maryland, I didn't know anybody, had no clue. A friend of mine was going to a county central committee meeting. I went to the meeting, sat in the corner of the room, heard them say some things, raised my hand and said, y'all don't know really what you're doing. 2 years later, I was chairman. So the reality of it is put yourself in the room. And you have that network, as has already been mentioned, that takes many forms and comes to you in many ways. But don't necessarily think you always have to go out, you know, I got to be in Washington or I got to be in the state capitol. Sometimes the greatest pathway to the best access and opportunity is in that local political office 2 blocks from your home. Walk in that space, introduce yourself, and begin to find out who the players are in your own community. Because at some point, to Jeff's point, I think it was to Libby's point, you're going to have to come back to them anyway. So you're going to need to know them. You don't want to burn bridges. You don't want to do any of that stuff. You just need to get to know people and understand where they are in your universe.
And Tessa and Libby, you've both run campaigns for major nationwide office. Could you describe what your first job was on a campaign? How did you get your foot in the door? Tessa, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So my first job on a campaign was actually was a deputy finance assistant, which is pretty funny because I'm not really a numbers person in terms of planning. But I did that, and what I learned from it is that it's really about relationships and it's really about follow-up and also getting it right. I mean, this was the days of copying checks, faxing them in, giving the thank you notes, all of these really glamorous things that, you know, anyone could do, but you had to get it right, because if you want a candidate to be angry at you, spell their cousin's name wrong and then have their cousin highlight it and send it back to you and say, excuse me, see you at Christmas, buddy, you know? So that was really my first job. But I also think just to add to what Chairman Steele said, I think it's really important that you are kind of a bit of a woodpecker when you're trying to get these jobs. For example, in Heidi's 2012 race, she was, no offense, Senator, but kind of an unknown candidate in a deeply red state, nationally I'm talking, not in North Dakota. And, you know, no one gave us a shot to win. So trying to find the caliber of staff that I knew we needed was tough. And it was a lot of actually reverse of what we're talking about here, of me calling people that I had worked with in the past or that I knew was talented to kind of get ideas from them, but also beg them to come themselves. Fast forward to the 2018 race, and people had a chance to get to know Heidi, and she's very likable and took some tough votes, and people respected that. And so we had more resumes than we knew what to do with, and that happens sometimes too. So to get through all of those, there has to be a hook. Either somebody calls you about someone that applies, or you know, you have the best vetting system in the history of the universe and should figure out how to sell it to other campaigns, because we've all gone through that, where you have, you know, this sort of all of these riches of opportunity in front of you to choose from. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to call on those people who helped you even know about the campaign to then put in a good word for you and move you to the top of the list.
Super. Libby, what was your first entry point into a campaign?
Sure. So my first paid entry point was being an intern in Senator Kent Conrad's reelection campaign, and I got to do the glamorous job of driving him to Macy's to pick out a new pair of pants. So, you know, it's all glamour, glamour, glamour on my side, which if you've met Ken Conrad, he's quite the fashionista. But yeah, to Tessa's point too, you know, in 2018, we were so lucky to have Heidi at the top of our ticket and have lots of national attention and money and those things, but we still needed people. And so one of the things that I would suggest to the students on this call too is that we hired folks, especially talented young people who came into our office to volunteer regularly. We hired several of them to join our campaign, whether it was interns or finance assistants or research assistants, because we saw them working so hard and they just came into the office and volunteered, and they did that pretty frequently, and we took them on as staff too. So that's one of the other ways to kind of Chairman Steele's point. You got to be there and you got to show up and you got to show how hard you work so that you too can be the person who's going to buy pants with the U.S. Senator.
Great. A number
You know,
of
Ed, if I
yeah,
could,
go ahead, Tom. Yeah.
You know, everybody started somewhere. And one thing I remember the people who gave me a break when I was, you know, a 19-year-old Pell Grant kid at Brown University. And, you know, I spent summers doing a host of different things. And I didn't have a Rolodex, or I guess you call it a contacts folder for today's generation. And people stepped up and helped me out, some of whom I really didn't know that well. And that's why, you know, it's a virtuous cycle. Everybody got helped by someone, and everybody knows that person who walks in their room. They're a little bit trepidatious about walking into the room because, oh, I don't know you, Jeff, or I don't know you, Michael. But what you'll find is that, you know, we've all been there, and you should never hesitate. You know, Thomas_Perez at brown.edu. I have a lot of contact with a lot of students, some of whom were my former students, one of whom is working at the DNC now, and we're glad to have him. And some of whom I never met, but came in. That's part of the social covenant, if you will, of how we do this stuff. And it's not a covenant limited to Democratic folks. I mean, I know Michael really well, and Michael's got a very, very big heart and a pretty large Rolodex, and a real capacity and willingness to brainstorm with you. So don't hesitate whatsoever to shoot an email to someone. Anyone on this call, I don't mean to speak for them, but I just know that we all have a really good memory of those first moments of our career where we were, you know, hungry and, you know, really wanting to do something and struggling to find that first opening.
I think we all share the value, and I'm inspired by the panelists in the value that we all think more political participation is better than less, and more involvement in campaigns is better than less. A number of students are asking, some anonymously, but also Seth asked this question: how do you think grassroots organization is going to look different because of the pandemic? Are there any aspects of what you're talking about that aren't relevant anymore? Or how are students supposed to think about applying for these jobs, getting into a campaign when they're also dealing with the restrictions of the pandemic?
I'm happy to start, but I don't want to hog this.
Go ahead, start, Tom.
Okay. I mean, we've changed our tactics, but we haven't changed our goals. We've been obviously we're hiring a lot. We have a battleground buildup program in all of the key battleground states, and the average age of organizers that we hire is it's about 23, something like that. And you are all very digitally savvy, and so while our tactics change, again, our goals don't. And we've trained 4,000 people in the last 3 weeks on digital organizing. There is just a voracious appetite right now for people. We're doing it with an organization called Run for Something, which helps down ballot candidates. And we've got a lot of candidates for school board and for state rep, and they need staff as well. And so in the moment, I would say to you, keep applying. We're going to have a presidential election in 210 days. That is going to happen. And we need to be ready for it. In the middle of the Civil War, we had a presidential election. In the middle of the 1918 pandemic, we had a midterm election. We've had elections in the aftermath of horrific natural disasters, and we have endured. And so if you are interested in this, bring your virtual clipboard with you, because those are the skills that you will hone. And those are skills that are frankly going to hold you in really good stead for a political career, because that is really, it's hard to door knock in North Dakota. And if you don't have that digital acumen, you're going to be less effective. So have at it. We're going gangbusters on the hiring.
Michael and Jeff, on with Republican campaigns, do you see any changes of approach or anything particularly innovative being done?
Jeff, why don't you start on that one?
Sure. I think everybody is trying to kind of feel their way through this, but to build on Chairman Perez's point, this ultimately, dozens of congressional races, Senate campaigns, governor's races, presidential campaign this year, the cycle will be determined based on how smartly each of these different campaigns react to the circumstances that are at play here. So there isn't necessarily a playbook, but you've got to keep driving, and you've got to keep the voter contact up. You've got to keep your fundraising up. You've got to be able to keep the operations side of this up. You've got to be able to keep working effectively with members of the media. You've got to be able to keep a strong digital and social campaign moving. So each campaign is going to approach it somewhat differently, but the need to solve that problem, and there's probably going to be a few different solutions. Some will work better than others, and ultimately that might end up impacting who ultimately is successful in the race. But everybody's going to be working to address it. So there's still going to be a need to jump in. I think those that put in the time early around digital activation, digital engagement, et cetera. The campaigns that did that the smartest ahead of time and are not scrambling, kind of with this, with their running around with their hair on fire saying we got to play catch up, but I've already actually had done the work because it was part of their plan to begin with. Those are going to be the campaigns that are most able to pivot to deal with kind of the new circumstances that are, we're going to be seeing for at least the next month or two.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Jeff nailed it in terms of how on the GOP side, these races are going to play themselves out. The reality of it is that Republicans, going back to the early days of its invention of micro-targeting, has always played a little bit advanced in this, wasn't so much known as technology or the technical space at the time, but that essentially what it was when you look at the races back in the early 90s through the present. Then you look at what at the presidential level the Trump team was able to do and what they're doing now. Internally, a lot of that has translated downstream. So you're seeing, to Jeff's point, a number of particularly the younger candidates, more aggressive candidates, taking advantage of technology. So the coronavirus pandemic has put us in a very different space where you're seeing an accelerated effort on the digital front. And I suspect, to Tom's point, although he didn't make this point specifically, when you look at the national conventions, when you look at some of the bigger events that are going to be taking place, even once the pandemic begins to subside, there's going to be a greater digital presence to them. And to the parties and the players, the campaigns and the candidates that are willing to take the risk to get into that space, make some early mistakes, learn by trial and error to some degree, they're going to be better prepared and better suited to play when you get to Labor Day and the race is afoot, to engage the voters along all the lines of what Tom was talking about and what Jeff were talking about, is particularly with respect to fundraising, organization, turn out the vote, and all of that. That's all going to be digital. That it's not going to be the old school knocking on the door on a Saturday morning to remind you to go vote on Tuesday. It's going to be a text message. It's going to be an email. It's going to be a phone call. It's going to be video chats. There's going to be a whole lot more of that. Even I think in the wake of a pandemic, which hopefully, God willing, has subsided significantly by the time we get to the fall and there's no reoccurrence. I think the chilling effect of that and the impact it has on our body politic will be long lasting.
We have oh, go ahead, Heidi. Yeah.
I was just going to add something about the value of creativity. I just talked to a young Brown student who was wondering, how do I do this now that I'm trying to help this candidate who's in a primary? I said, well, who's her network? Who's this candidate's network? And can you have a virtual coffee party where you can get your candidate in the room talking about these issues? And, everybody's doing this right now. They're trying to figure out, how do they stay socially connected? You can use that desire for social connection right now to make it about not politics necessarily, but how do we get our schools better connected so kids don't fall behind? And, so I recommended, well, why don't you do a webinar on teaching parents how to teach 8th grade math? Think creatively, I guess is what I'm saying. And if you come with creative ideas in some of these local races about how you can use digital to broaden the appeal, because in many of the races that you run or that you might be looking at, getting 5,000 votes wins you the job. So count your votes. I mean, it's always been about counting votes. The question is, how do you reach out and get those votes, and how do you pyramid your and the person who comes with the best idea on how to pyramid and how to grow their social influence on social platforms, I think has a real leg up.
And Ed, can I jump in really quickly just to say this, sort of to make sure we're not dissuading folks from getting involved given the pandemic, that we've shifted our organizing at the DNC to digital. Obviously, we've been doing a lot of phone calls with groups in battleground states with Tom, and we've had record participation. As Heidi said, people are looking for an outlet to communicate, to be heard, to channel some of their frustration. So there are lots of opportunities out there to still help and get involved, both paid and unpaid, but know that people are really, really hungry for that connection and are kind of channeling it into political work.
We had a couple of students who were asking questions about how to interview, and they were following up a little bit on, Jeff, your point about standing out. So Heidi, if I understand what you and Libby are saying, is the idea that the students can show up to an interview having maybe organized something, maybe it's a group of parents for education, but they demonstrate that creativity on their own, and then they show up to the interview able to describe that. Is that the idea?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, virtual parades. So a kid who shows up said, look, you aren't going to be able to go to a St. Patty's Day parade because there ain't one. And so how do you network with the Irish American community if that's an important constituency? If I were a campaign manager or a candidate and a kid came or a student came with a great idea on how to organize that, it may not be their job, but I know that they're thinking about how do you make these transitions, and that would be. So I think don't come and say, this is what I'm interested in. Come with some ideas on how you can help that candidate adapt to the changing circumstances. Because those are skills students have that a lot of old people don't. And so they're terrified, that old candidates are terrified of this time because they don't have the skill sets that this brave new world requires. They're going to be looking for young people exactly with those skill sets.
And I love that idea. I love that idea that 5,000 votes or 500 votes in a lot of Republican or Democratic races is going to make a big difference, and it's just really important. There's I noticed that Lucas has a digital hand raised. So Lucas, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for hosting this panel. Senator Heitkamp told me it would happen, and this is definitely a promise kept. My question is related to what you were just mentioning. Will you tend to learn more working on a more competitive campaign in a more competitive race?
I think in terms of the competition between campaigns in any given cycle, it depends. It depends on the type of campaign, whether it's a local race for sheriff or county executive or a statewide office. They will all bring their own degree of competitiveness and the dynamics of them. If you have a candidate who's sort of a fresh out of the box upstart that folks hadn't seen before or really heard of before, who's kind of shaking things up, they create their own competition. And so, but you don't know that at the beginning. You don't know how competitive a race is going to be until the campaign is afoot. And that really goes to some of the points that were made earlier in our discussion, particularly by Chairman Perez, when he talked about, connect to the candidates that you identify with, which is a good place to start. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a philosophical, like, they're a conservative, therefore I'm going to go with them, or they're a progressive, I'm going to go with them. There's a connection that candidate or vibe they're putting out there that you connect to. But you don't know when you join that campaign how competitive it's going to be or how it's ultimately going to turn out. But lightning has a way of striking in these things, and you can all of a sudden find yourself in a race that's very, very competitive. Now, if a race has been underway for a while and you come into the campaign a quarter of the way into the campaign season after, things have been going on for 3 or 4 months or whatever, then you have a better sense of maybe to judge that competitiveness and you can make that assessment. But even there, I still think the value is not so much in looking into which race is competitive or not competitive or what's going to be competitive or what isn't, but looking into the value of that candidate, your connection to that candidate, because in most cases, and folks here on here can correct me if I'm wrong if they have not had this experience, when you're out in public, you are an extension of that candidate. So if you don't feel that candidate, if you're not down with that vibe, voters are going to know it. And they're going to sit there and go, well, you don't seem to be that excited about him. Why should I be excited about him? So that whole idea of competition is one that, sometimes the press will write about it and you'll see it. But a lot of times it's created by how you present the campaign as well, as much as it is what the political pundits and the talking heads are deeming to be a competitive race.
Michael, a little bit on that point, and this is really a question for anybody. Morgan asks, when you, the student, are deciding which campaign to work for, what should you look for beyond political congruence with a candidate? So yes, you want to, on the one hand, have all the energy and show that you're really enthusiastic, but for some of these students, maybe they're thinking about this as a career option and a way in with somebody who might be a really great employer, even if he or she doesn't have exactly the same political values. So what do you all think about the different kinds of attributes that students should weigh when they're deciding to join on somebody's campaign? And I know some of you are here with your current or previous bosses. So.
I was going to defer to those guys.
Yeah, exactly. Jeff, you looked like you were about to say something, so let me defer to you.
I was going to jump in and say one thing. I probably, looking back over, and as a Republican who dealt with presidential campaigns in 2008 and 2012, I saw my share of losing races. I probably learned more from losing campaigns, being on losing campaigns, than I did being on winning campaigns. The opportunity, the opportunity in the network, and I guess the post campaign employment opportunities were better when you win, no doubt about that. But in terms of just from a pure learning perspective, both as a junior employee and then also as a junior staffer, and then also kind of taking on more strategic roles, being on those losing races and watching it move, that is a better education tool for the next race and it's incumbent upon you to actually take the learnings from those losing races and turn them into winning races. And I was lucky enough to be able to be part of that as well. But the losing race, that puts you the water's boiling a little bit hotter, and therefore you're pushing your bounds a little bit further. You're learning a little bit more. You're fighting a little bit harder. That I think ultimately helps down the. It might not help right away, but down the road, looking back, it's incredibly effective. In terms of other things to look at, yes, ideological congruence, the personality, the ability, the candidate, his or her ability to connect with voters and pull people together and make them strive for something kind of bigger than themselves. Ultimately, that motivates voters, that ultimately motivates staffers. But all of that is important. But I will also harken back to a point that Senator Heitkamp made about being selfish and looking and saying, all right, I know I'm here, and while I don't know exactly what's going to get me to from point 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 and 2 to 3 and 3 to 4, I ultimately know where point 5, where I'd like to get to at point 5, and then I can start charting the course from 1 to 2 and so on to get me to 5, and then look for opportunities that help kind of create those landing spots between where I am right now and where I'm hoping to get to 10 years down the road.
I think Jeff made some really important points there. I spent the better part of a decade at the Justice Department, and I interviewed hundreds of potential prosecutors, many of whom would come to me and say, I never lost a case. Show me a prosecutor who's never lost a case. I'll show you a prosecutor with low aim.
Yeah.
And I never hired any of those folks. And so don't go into this with an idea that I've got to win every time I am out there. I've had the privilege of working in a lot of different organizations, large, small, and in between, ranging from the Labor Department to, when I was on the county council, there were 5 of us. And I think it's really important to understand the notion of culture. When you look at whether it's a Fortune 500 company, a nonprofit, a political office, a political campaign, you want to figure out you want to make a judgment of what's the culture of this organization going to be. If you have a good culture, and I know culture is at times an amorphous concept, but I will let you in on a secret. There are Democrats and Republicans who are really good people to work for. And there are Democrats and Republicans that if you told me that I'm thinking of going to work for that person, I'd tell you to head for the hills. Yeah. That is not a partisan observation. But I think it's really important to understand that cultural fit and how you fit in.
How would a student know? Sorry, Tom. How would a student know ex ante, though, what the culture is like of a particular campaign or individual?
You gotta. I would find that person. So it's person X. You figure out, other people that know and have worked with that person, and you say, what kind of person was, what was that person? Maybe that person was, active in the PTA, and now they're running for school board or state rep. So talk to folks that served in the PTA. There's one person that comes to mind that ran for the county council here where I live that I knew really well. And a good friend of mine went to work for her. She didn't ask my opinion. Afterwards, she wished she had. I would have told her. But, God, I'm not going to go and, God, it's not my role to affirmatively tell her that what she's walking into. And so, whenever I'm hiring anyone, yes, someone will give me references, but I always try to do what we call offline reference checking. Figure out, who's in that person's circle so you can get a handle on who that person is. So, find out. I will tell you, people who have worked for Heidi Heitkamp would jump off a cliff for Heidi Heitkamp. Yeah, that's what you would learn if you were thinking about when Heidi Heitkamp runs for president in 2028. That's what people would say about her.
And if I could, Tom, I can second that, because even on the Republican side, we know that's true. So
amen. No,
I can second that.
You know, and again, and I reiterate what I said, and there are Democrats and Republicans that, you know, where we would have the opposite conversation. True. So yeah, you should definitely, I know you're going to be hungry to get into a campaign, but make sure you actually do some homework so that you don't get yourself into an experience that you end up regretting.
Great. Zena writes in with two questions. One, she's asking what tips you'd have for organizing and working on campaigns in areas that you're not from, which of course is particularly challenging right now where we can't easily move across state lines. And then a second question, if so much of getting into a campaign is dependent on networking, what in your experience are campaigns doing to reach out to people who may not have such great networks, or, you know, whether they're from underrepresented groups or geographies that are underrepresented? What do campaigns do to reach out to be more inclusive? So one question on, can students work for campaigns in areas that they're not from? How do you do that? And then second, how do the campaigns themselves become more inclusive in who they're recruiting?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the first swing at this and do the second part first. You know, the other thing besides relationships and sort of more traditional application processes, there's also the groups that do training, right? For example, Wellstone Action is a place that we look to a lot if you're running a campaign in the Midwest, or really anywhere, but particularly in the Midwest. Most of the people that apply and go to that school on the Democratic side are Midwesterners. So they talk like us and they look like us, and that's who we want on the streets for us. Right? I'm not sure what the Republican counter is to that, but I'm sure that it exists. I also think that what you guys do at Brown is incredibly important. I went to a very small liberal arts college who actually wasn't very liberal at all. And a lot of people that I could look to try to get involved in Democratic politics. So I kind of did it on my own by volunteering and stuffing mail at first. So I think it all depends on where you are and who you know and what your particular situation is, certainly. But also, it's about these other groups that are out there working on the issues that you care about, and knowing those people who are probably connected, not just thinking only in the Democrat, Republican, independent, whatever lane, but the organizations that are partners with campaigns, such as the unions and the chamber. And there are a lot of other organizations that have a pretty direct pipeline, if not to the candidate, to the manager, and those are really well-respected opinions. So I would encourage that. And the first part was what again?
About how do campaigns be more inclusive in terms of reaching out to recruit people who may not have a lot of networks or social capital?
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to jump on. Oh, go ahead, Tessa.
Go ahead, Chairman.
One of the things that we did at the DNC in the run-up to this presidential cycle is an initiative called Organizing Corps. This is a year, we started this shortly after the midterms. And it's an effort to hire, train, deploy 1,200 organizers in 8 key battleground states. And our first cohort of hires, the first 300 we did, was 76% organizers of color, 95% homegrown. You know, in the ideal world, if you're running for election in North Dakota and you're trying to organize in Indian country, for instance, you want to have somebody from the community. It is exceedingly helpful. 27% were LGBTQ, and we were very intentional in how we hired, because we really in the 8 battleground states where they're deployed, many of the areas they're going are communities of color where we have a real deficit. You know, we now have a much more muscular rural portfolio because of Libby and because of advocacy from people like Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Donnelly and others, because we know we need to do that. And we also pay these folks. You know, when I got to the DNC, we didn't pay our interns. And it should come as a surprise to no one that when we started paying our interns, our racial diversity doubled in our first class. You know, I was a Pell Grant kid. If someone said to me, Tom, you want to work at the DNC? When I was in college, I would have said, great. Do you want to work for free? I said, no way. And I might have had a word between the no and the way. And and so that's the reality of our world. And organizing corps really is for us a real effort to get folks that we know have great potential. None of the first 300 that we hired, I think, had worked on campaigns. Maybe there was a handful, but most of them hadn't. But they had tremendous leadership potential. And we're trying to turn this into a career ladder for folks. And that's a hard thing. I'm sure both Jeff and Tessa and Libby can speak to the difficulty of maintaining a career ladder in a business where it's a gig economy. And the gig is you go from campaign to campaign. It's kind of hard to do, but we're working on that too.
And Jeff and Michael, or really anybody, but Jeff and Michael, in the Republican campaigns you've been involved in, can you talk about some efforts to reach out either to traditionally underrepresented groups or to people out of state maybe who may be recruited into a campaign?
Yeah, it's on the Republican side. It has been a bit more challenging for a variety of reasons that, I think a lot of us probably are familiar with, just in terms of the dynamics in politics and the approach of the parties to some of these things. I can speak to my experience on the one hand as a county chairman, state chairman, and national chairman, but then more specifically as national chairman, taking those two other experiences and sort of combining them with the frustration and anxieties that state parties have around the country in this space, particularly those state parties that are located in communities that are not Iowa, that are not 97% white, and where the politics is quite honestly a little bit easier in that sense. When you throw in race, when you throw in ethnicity, when you throw in sexuality, when you throw in all of these other very human characteristics that make up and define people, it becomes a little bit more challenging for the political parties. And I applaud Tom and what he's doing and the new effort. But I think if you step back and look historically, there aren't a whole lot of Black campaign managers. There aren't a whole lot of Black political directors. There aren't a whole lot of Asian, treasurers and finance directors, or Hispanic communications directors. So the reality of it is the efforts have to catch up to where the body politic is. In other words, where the people are, and then put in place the runways and the landing pads for them. It's one way to create the pathway and get them to the door. It's something very different once they're in the room. And that is much, it needs to be protected and reinforced as the effort to get them to the door. On my side of the aisle, and Jeff and I, we know this as grassroots guys, there are always efforts to sort of, we want to get the African-American vote, we want to get the Hispanic vote, but that oftentimes runs into a very different reality when you're running in Mississippi, a very different reality when you're running in New York City. And so the parties have to adapt and be accommodating in that regard. And the way they are is when they don't just give lip service to it, but they put real money behind it, as Tom has discussed. When they put real effort behind it and make it a longer term project, because this is not something that gets done or turned around in one cycle. It's not something that gets done or turned around in 3 cycles. It is a longer term effort. We had, when I was national chairman, built a national network of 380 individuals across the country who were the eyes and ears, but more importantly, the mouth of the party, because they were on the ground. And so I wanted them to be the key leaders in the communities where they lived to help take the message and the efforts of the party from a national or a statewide level and bring it closest to the people, and be the ones in the town hall meetings, having the discussion, listening, getting into the political back and forth, so that the public could see the party was engaged, and they were engaged with people who actually look like the people who live in that community. And that's a very, very important effort.
Hey, excuse me. Hey, Ed, can I just jump in on the first part of that question with what I think is a very practical piece of advice that I unfortunately have learned the hard way? When you're organizing in communities that you're not from, and it can be, I'm from North Dakota and I've organized across North Dakota, and people are skeptical of folks from Fargo, in Bow Bells. And so it can be a challenge even in the same state. But one of the things that I would recommend to any organizer or person going into a state or community that they're not from is to, local Democrats can either be your best friends or your worst enemies, and you want them to be your friends. And nobody likes to feel like, folks are coming in and kind of putting the heavy hand of the DNC or the state party or whatever, whomever you might work for, to get those local folks on your side, to learn from them, to hear from them, to meet with them before you go out into the community. I think they can be a real asset to you or a roadblock, and you'd prefer the former. Great. That's very helpful. There's a practical question that has been asked anonymously. What's the timeline looking like for this year's cycle? So when really did campaigns begin staffing up? And we can split that between local, state races, national races. How do students hit the staffing moment how do they hit that at the right moment?
Yesterday, last month, right now. Is the answer. I mean, our battleground buildup is well underway. There are a number of Senate races. I know, I don't want to speak for Senator Heitkamp, but there are so many opportunities out there. They are well underway. Races up and down the ticket. We're very focused, not just on the federal races, but on races across the country. And when we're hiring organizers, we look for what we're called nested opportunities. So, for instance, in North Carolina, we have a presidential, we have a gubernatorial, we have a Senate race. We have at least 3 or 4 districts there that we might be able to win on the House side. We have an opportunity to flip the state Senate and an opportunity to flip the state House. And so we know the districts that are most relevant to those state Senate and state House races. We know the districts relevant to those House races. So we are literally, as we speak, staffing up for people that we can place strategically so that they can help 6 different campaigns at the same time through the work they're doing. Obviously, they're not going to be knocking doors in the foreseeable future, but there's so much more that goes into an effective campaign. And so you should be looking right now. And that's not, and I think, I think that's true across the board. We are going to have an election in 210 days. Who's counting? I am. And we have, so I would reframe it. We have 210 days till the weekend. And the one thing I can't get back is last week. And so that's why we're doing our level best. And people like Libby and, others are, Zoom is my new best friend. And so I would urge you, if you're thinking about trying to get on a campaign, dust those resumes off or get them together, work your networks, and do it now.
Great. And there's an additional practical question, again, asked anonymously. The student asked that, it says that a lot of the campaigns that she or he's contacted have said they're unable to offer any pay because they're short of funds due to COVID. Do you all as a panel know whether there are any funding sources or scholarships that might be able to help cover basic living expenses, whether on the Republican side, Democratic side, for students who get involved in campaigns?
I would. That's a harder pill because of it's campaigning is very different than a lot of other things that you may be involved in, where there may be some third party support for it, a foundation or some organization that kind of put up housing or whatever for students to come in for internships and things like that. Campaigns, I think, as has already been noted, are very, very personal. They're very, it's you, the candidate, and your campaign mates. You're all kind of in the soup together. I think Senator Heitkamp made the point very early on that, you're in it. You're there. You just you show up. You do the job for 100 hours a week. And you're probably either crashing at the campaign headquarters in between efforts anyway, or you're crashing at a friend's pad. You kind of double up and triple up. I just don't know, at least on the Republican side, maybe Jeff may have on the Republican side, folks who sponsor that way for, people who are working on campaigns. But I typically have not found that kind of support. Now, campaigns have a way of sort of working those things out, particularly with, some of the volunteers who may come from other locations and so forth. But there typically is, not that I'm aware of, a real concerted, sort of effort and here's a program you can get into and they'll cover your housing or, whatever, or stipend. That doesn't happen so much on the campaign side.
I think that's right. There's always an ability and a need to be creative on that front. I have more friends that have, been sleeping on sofas, or a congressional candidate's donors or lawyers, bonus room, or, something along those lines. I know people, I definitely know a couple guys who slept on a campaign RV at night when it wasn't being used. Like, you see it all. I think there are some kind of, and I'm definitely the non-lawyer on this webinar, but I know there's also kind of some questions, that you have to be careful about in terms of, in-kind contributions or an outside entity unduly kind of financing or benefiting a candidate campaign that you have to be somewhat cognizant of. But I think the more you're able to think creatively, the more you're willing to, you think you think you need to spend, a grand a month on an apartment, but you can find one for $500, or you're sharing an extra bedroom for some, whatever it might be. The ability to be creative, if that's what it needs to get your foot in the door and be able to help set yourself up for future success, you have to be willing to make that sacrifice. It's not on campaigns. It is not all going to be handed to you, and you've got to be able to think creative. And again, it definitely is a sacrifice.
What?
Thanks.
If
Heidi, go ahead.
I just want to add one point. So much of what's going to happen here is digital. You can be at your mother's house and do some creative work. And so if you said, look, I can help you raise some money, I can help you work on the campaign, but I can't move to Iowa. I'm going to do it from, Providence, or I'm going to do it from Boston. Can I have a chance to at least try that? And so, I think you should think about, the fact that the skill sets now are not knocking on doors. They're not going to a campaign office. It's more a collaboration like this. What can you do from a place where it is cheaper for you to live is another good question you should ask yourself.
Fantastic. One more practical, and I think we're going to have to make this the last question because we're running to the end of our allotted time, but this was also asked anonymously. But the student asks, is it okay to be available only during the summer, until classes resume in the fall? Is that a viable proposition?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of our campaigns that we've worked on have had summer or semester long interns who have either taken a break from school or used their summer break to do that. It might not be a full-time position or a staff position, but certainly there are opportunities there, particularly kind of in this brave new world as we're figuring things out too. We're going to need more help doing digital stuff as Heidi mentioned. But yes, absolutely, there are opportunities.
Super. Any other ideas about summer type opportunities and the nature of those opportunities?
Well, if I can say, one of the jobs on a campaign is research, and that's both research in terms of, the candidates who are running, but also in terms of issues. And again, you know, you can make a real contribution in each one of these areas without making it full-time into the fall. One of the things I would caution you all, though, as you look at this, you're going to get invested and you may not want to come back to school. And that happens more often than not, that somebody gets engaged in the summer and then decides, look, I'm gonna see this through until November. And I think their experience is richer because of it. But the various roles in campaigns can be isolated. And, you know, we used a lot of summer folks to work parades. You know, if you don't mind walking in a parade, you'll always have a summer job on a campaign.
Yeah.
Well, look, this has been inspiring. I'm ready to jump out and join a campaign. You've all really provided us extremely helpful information and inspiring information across the aisle at a time when there's, well, maybe not a lot of inspiration in the air. So I want to particularly, again, thank you, Heidi Heitkamp, because you really conceived of this panel and it's coming at just the right moment. But I want to thank the entire panel, Heidi Heitkamp, Tom Perez, Michael Steele, Tessa Gould, Jeff Sadowski, and Libby Schneider. You've all been terrific. I want to thank the students for your great questions. And I'll just finish by again saying, follow what our panelists have done on all sides of the aisle. Get involved, run for office, get involved in campaigns, and help solve the challenges that we all face.